So Professor Stephen Hayes, thank you so much for taking time for the local chapter, the Dutch chapter of the ACBS.
I'm excited to be able to talk with you. I'm glad to have the opportunity.
Oh, wow. Well, ACT is all about context, and we thought it would be nice to ask some ACT-related questions that we came across in our Dutch-Belgian context.
Yeah. So, I'm looking forward to hearing the questions, seeing what you're dealing with here as part of the, you say, BeNe?
Yeah, indeed. ACBS BeNe, it's great pronunciation. We're honored that you even tried.
Yeah,
Dutch chapter is fine as well.
Yes.
So I guess one of the major challenges we're dealing with is that ACT isn't included in the evidence-based treatment guidelines for the Netherlands and Belgium.
Yes.
I was wondering, where is the evidence of ACT? Where do we stand right now?
Well, there's several things to say about that. Actually, this could be a long answer. Stop me if I'm going on too long. You know, ACT is part of CBT writ large, and that's often people forget that, and many of the elements that are there are things that we do have additional evidence on, but just within the ACT community, defined fairly specifically to ACT and very closely related procedures, acceptance-based behavior therapy, and so forth. We're now producing randomized trials in about 1 every 12 days. We have 115 total. Of course, some of these are very small trials. Mm-hmm. I'm proud of the fact that students are interested in doing these projects, but not just that, people in the developing world. So for example, there's 6 randomized trials out of Iran.
Yeah, wow.
And if you put them into, you know, very science skeptic kind of blender of, oh, these are small and they don't have all the gold-plated doorknobs that come from grant-funded projects. Well, that's true, but if you look at the peaks, we have many grant-funded and highly competent projects. And in addition, you need to consider the fact that many of these guidelines are linked to what I think most people would say is a phase that is fast passing away. In the U.S., you can't even get grant funding from the National Institute on Mental Health for randomized trials focused on DSM syndrome. They're no longer funded.
Okay.
They have to be focused on core processes that might organize things into treatment responsive units. Of course, that would be a very friendly idea to the ACBS
It's a nice
community.
Development, right?
It's a nice development.
Yeah.
In truth, it's a little too biologically oriented because they really think those core processes would be
biological.
Would be neurobiological signatures. But that's fine. We can play with that. There are in fact neurobiological signatures. The evidence is beginning to show. Around psychological flexibility processes. But if you get the science skeptics in the room and they want many trials on specific syndromes, any new method, unless it's very focused on only one thing, and ACT is focused on so many things, is not going to be able to get through that filter. The total number of trials we have right now, randomized trials, about 115.
Yeah, it's amazing.
But about a third of those are in mental health and substance abuse, about a third in behavioral health, and then a third in other areas like organizational issues, sports, things of that kind. So I think we just need to be patient. We need to keep working and not get our heads down, but also try to work to increase the quality of the research. And what you're seeing in the United States, for example, is that ACT is entering into evidence-based guidelines in a few areas. And once that happens, then the door begins to open. I think right now, if they allowed us to do something like saying disorders of experiential avoidance, which to my way of thinking would be actually better empirically supported than some of the syndromes people are trying to focus on, we would unquestionably meet the guidelines anyway. So it's a difficult phase to be in, but you have some very good researchers here in the Dutch community and who are contributing actively and are writing very nice meta-analyses and so forth. So I think you're getting a fair look at ACT and a good production of data from the different research teams in the Dutch community who are research producers. So I'm very hopeful that this phase won't last very long.
And eventually ACT will land in the treatment guidelines of the Dutch community as well.
I think it unquestionably will. Really, what would stop it? Because we know from the early trials and from as the evidence builds, and especially as we get research teams that focus. If you look at Ernst Wollmeyer's work, for example, and then you look at the series of studies, and showing not just that depression moves, but flourishing increases, and that it doesn't just work in face-to-face, but you can do it in books, or you can do it in websites and so forth. I mean, eventually, no matter how skeptical people are,
picked up at some point, right? Same goes for chronic pain, I guess, right? It's
right now we have
so strong.
13 to 15 randomized trials in chronic pain, and some very well done long-term follow-ups, 3 years and so forth. For goodness sakes, in the United States, that's the area where it's recognized at a high level.
Yeah.
And of course, there are skeptics who say, "Oh no, it's not high; it's medium." Okay. Oh, we'll keep producing. We'll keep producing.
Yeah. So I was wondering, in the same line, I guess a follow-up question, since in the treatment guidelines of the Netherlands, traditional CBT is the predominant therapy form. Definitely in multi-treatment centers where you work with multiple therapists on one client, you will get into a situation where the first therapist has to start with CBT, since that's in the treatment guidelines. But of course, there are quite some ACT enthusiasts who want to start with ACT as well.
Yeah.
And the thing would be, is it possible to do CBT, traditional CBT, and ACT at the same time? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, ACT is part of the CBT tradition writ large. It comes out of behavior therapy, and still to this day, if you do component analysis of CBT, the lion's share of the outcome is accomplished by the behavioral elements.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I've called in the '99 book ACT called it out as a form of contextual CBT, and so but what I mean by that is not the traditional CBT model. But if you'd have said, is there really strong evidence for the traditional CBT model, and for the mediators that are indicated by CBT theory, traditional CBT theory, and for the elements that have been added beyond the behavioral elements that were there before the CBT movement started, you'd have a very hard time building the case that that's evidence-based. I mean, when they've done meta-analyses on cognitive restructuring, for example, above and beyond behavioral methods, very solid people, not ACT people, nobody skeptical, say that it's hard to argue that it's adding very much to the variance in outcomes. And to this day, there's no consistent mediator on traditional CBT, and there's several recent studies that some people present as negative. I don't view them as negative at all, showing that ACT processes mediate traditional CBT.
Yeah.
Well, you won't find me saying that it's a big problem that our model and our measures turn out to be what's important in psychopathology and its treatment. If other people have been moving those processes, great. Now that we know what's important, come in, help us learn how to move them even more quickly. And if you can show that you have ways of getting more impact on diffusion, more impact on experiential openness or values focus, more impact on psychological flexibility, well then we in the ACT community want that as part of our methods, because our real interests are processes linked to procedures, linked to outcomes, and that are much deeper commitment is to the processes than the specific procedures, and to the knowledge development strategy over the specific theories and processes. So I'm actually buoyed up by the fact that we have evidence now that cognitive restructuring, when it works more by cognitive flexibility and diffusion.
And that's an interesting part, since I can understand how traditional BT in the CBT is really compatible with ACT all the way, I guess. But the cognitive structuring versus diffusion, that's quite a...
Well, you'd think, but you have to be careful, because two things have happened. One is that traditional CBT is traditional CBT.
True, yeah.
It's changing at light speed. Of course, by the time it's all changed, they'll say they invented it, but that's okay. we don't have to get prideful. That's how change happens. Is people run out ahead of the parade after it's gone down the other street, and that's fine. But you can think about it this way. If I suggest some possible other ways of thinking about something, I could do it inside a frame that says, don't think this, you need to think that. Or I could do it inside a frame that's more like, actually, in addition to thinking this, you could also think that. But it's very compatible with our methods. Yeah. And in fact, if you look at the process data, what mediates cognitive reappraisal in terms of outcome is psychological flexibility. So in other words, if you do reappraisal to produce flexibility, if that's the purpose of it, it actually works perfectly well. If you do reappraisal as a process of avoidance, elimination, subtraction, it doesn't work well. Well, knowing that brings us together with our colleagues, and we don't have to be in competition. We can say, let's work together. Now that we know that's the real core process, to learn how to move these even better. And so part of what I would suggest to that community is if you have a way of engaging your CBT colleagues, engage them because you're part of that tradition, and there's no reason to go to war over the model when the data are suggesting that it's really important across these procedures or processes that are inside the psychological flexibility model. So in the United States and in other countries, you're seeing a lot of movement in that way, where people are being given continuing education credits or being authorized to do practice inside these newer contextual forms of CBT. One thing that does distress me, and this doesn't seem fair, is if people would take something like, let's say, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and say, oh, that should be in the guidelines. You see, that's cognitive therapy, that's CBT. Oh, ACT is very far out. This is crazy. I mean, come on. I mean, who do you think we are? I mean, look at where we came from, look at what we do. And we shouldn't be penalized just because we don't want to say we have a traditional cognitive model, when the traditional cognitive model is not how CBT works anyway.
From the data, right?
Yeah.
It's more the behavioral part, actually. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, but I don't want to war over that or shame anybody or something. We can do it in a more friendly way, but we also have to stand up and let the data speak and not be bullied by people who don't like the fact that we're not talking in exactly the same way that their heroes were talking, or their intellectual grandfathers.
But I really liked it. In my mind, it was quite distinct in a sense, like the restructuring versus diffusion. But in a sense, you can actually explain both processes from the psychological.
Yeah, and I think if you just look at the tapes of people doing cognitive reappraisal, cognitive restructuring, there's big differences in how they do it.
Yeah.
And if you look at the process data, I think there's big reasons to think that doing it in a way that's more in tune with ACBS sensitivities is better supported by the data. So maybe even there's a way for us to find alliances and partnerships.
I want to switch over to some specifics of the Dutch health system.
Sure.
And that is that we do need to label clients with a DSM diagnosis to get funded, in a sense, to be able to get treatment reimbursed.
Sure.
And of course, with that DSM cap on, quite easily leads to symptom reduction thinking.
Sure.
So I'm wondering, where do you stand? Do you have some advice how we have to use the DSM in a sense, but how can we do that without getting stuck in that symptom reduction mode in a sense?
Yeah, it is a problem. Fortunately, one of the ironies inside the research work is that ACT, when it doesn't focus on symptoms, does perfectly well on symptoms.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Which is, and in addition, we get to have a conversation with the field and with the community and with the funders and with the government about what people really want. And I think a big ally for us there are patients themselves and the self-help movements and advocacy movements. You don't get people advocating for reductions in 5 out of 9 or 4 out of 7. You just don't. people want quality of life, they want a job, they want relationships, they want to be part of society. And so I would say the idea of person-centered health is spreading across the world. The importance of self-determination and the clients themselves being part of what they want. If we get people pushing people into cubby holes and into 4 out of 7s or 5 out of 9 type symptom lists, yes, of course, when you're in China, you speak Chinese, we'll play that game, we'll show what we can, but we have to insist and advocate for the values-based goals of our clients and of their families. And frankly, of the work sites and funders and people who want to see psychosocial improvement, not just symptom change. And we do even better when you do that. And it puts us on the right side of history. I mean, you have to know that the symptom lists are not a forever kind of thing, because there's something ethically wrong about them, there's something practically wrong about them, and they're not holding up scientifically.
I'm glad to actually bring that up, since the Dutch government also has another requirement that we use routine outcome monitoring with specific self-report measurements, and you can already guess which type. The symptom reduction type, the SCL90, the OQ45, I guess, is in there. And there's not really anything like the third wave experiential avoidance type of questionnaires in there.
Well, but if you look at, let's just take a recent Dutch study where 3,000 patients were followed with regular clinical interviews. It was published recently, November 2014, in Behavioral Therapy from a very well-known Dutch research group. And they looked at the natural trajectories of distress and depression and anxiety-related disorders, and showed that they were mediated by psychological flexibility, they were predicted by psychological flexibility, and the tendency for single problems to become multiple problems were entirely mediated or partially mediated, depending on exactly where you're looking, by psychological flexibility. So you could, over a 4-year period, predict who's going to become a chronic multi-problem patient versus who's going to be able to hold the line with a single disorder or see them relieved or go away, or who is going to develop a disorder or didn't have one on the basis of these flexibility processes. Well, that's a nice conversation to have with the government.
Yeah,
Here's your own data,
yeah,
your own citizens. You know, you pick the path that you want to foster.
Yeah.
When we know what mediates these things longitudinally with real clinical interviews, very well done, carefully done study, we're a tradition that knows how to focus on and change these flexibility processes. And there we get into a different conversation. Instead of simply saying, here's the randomized trial for this syndrome, sub-syndrome, blah, 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 we can say, here's this process that's known to be critical. You have it in your own database, and we know how to move it, and we know that when we move it, we get good outcomes. And so I think the data will eventually, if we can speak for it, it doesn't speak for itself. We have to speak for it. But we also have to speak for the ethical values and the choices of our clients, and not stand silent when people are being shoved into syndromal cubbyholes against their will. It's not right. And you know in the long run it will not survive. There's nothing in democratic Western society that's going to say that you can objectify and dehumanize people and label them in that way against their will. If people want to have a high quality life defined in terms of things like their ability to relate to others and to have a meaningful work and so forth, that has to be in our health guidelines, and not just in mental health. We're seeing the same thing in physical health, where people are demanding that these issues of functionality and the individual goals of the person be included in the healthcare guidelines.
It's getting more and more important, right? Yeah. I was wondering, do you have some suggestion for that routine outcome monitoring that's now quite symptom focused? What kind of measurements should we include to broaden the scope?
Well, you would do a big step forward by just including quality of life. If you could take the World Health Organization measures of quality or something like that, very well established and act as very well in these measures. It shouldn't be a hard sell because it's so well established and already. It's just that we have to get out of simply thinking in terms of these syndromal categories and the hope that, I think the false hope, that someday they'll turn into diseases. They're not going to. 50 years is enough. We've poured money down that rabbit hole. In the United States, we've stopped doing it. And I think that's just the canary in the coal mine, that it's not going to continue in the same way because people need a different way to think about health than the traditional syndromal way in the area of mental health and substance abuse and behavioral health writ large.
The first line of psychological treatment has now been reduced to 5 sessions.
Yeah.
So that's not a lot to work with.
Yeah.
I was wondering, is ACT actually usable in that short time span, and is it effective when you do that effective?
Well, I think we have to recognize that the behavioral health needs of the people are so huge, and the ability to meet those needs is so limited, that we're going to have to think in a very flexible way ourselves as therapists and as researchers and as providers. So, for example, I think we need more of a stepped care model in which we have peer support groups, and we have websites, and we have apps, and we have bibliotherapy. And yes, we have face-to-face, but we also have groups, and we have additional sessions when we need them. But in addition to let's provide evidence-based treatment as the front line, let's do triage and provide stepped care treatment so that you can get low-cost procedures that have a chance to be effective, put out not for everybody, but for people where you have good evidence-based reasons to think that it might be helpful. I mean, you have to be just shocked, I think. And you have Dutch data. If you look at Living Life to the Fullest, Ernst Bollmeier's book, you look at the effect sizes of that book and the cost of it, and then think of a course of treatment. And no, the effect sizes are not quite as large as a course of treatment, but it's a good, healthy chunk of that. And why wouldn't you use that as a front line or as an adjunct when you had good reasons to believe that it might be adequate? If conversely somebody comes in with multiple problems and they've already been through a course of treatment, have failed and so forth, and you think, okay, we're going to need more. We need a better science, better evidence on these kinds of moderators. But I've been in my own work with computerized ACT and with apps and with bibliotherapy.
So the e-health version of ACT in a sense, right? Yeah, I was wondering, what are your experience with that?
Well, there's right now something like 14 randomized trials of books, apps, websites, and they are very consistently helpful.
Okay, that's great.
In almost every study they've been helpful. The effect size appears to be about 2/3 of what you're getting with normal courses of treatment.
So the face-to-face versions.
Yes, but you do have to get engagement, and it looks like some of the technology that's there, such as having some person who can monitor it and have some human contact, even if it's in the form of a text message or something, may need to be there.
So you need to have a sense that someone's watching, that it's not just a computer.
I think it appears as though that might be helpful. There's an area that's coming in the U.S. Now with 3 studies that are out and very large grants coming that have already been funded. And I want to sort of do a call out to that so that you can track it. Jonathan Ricker's work on using ACT for smoking has already been tested now in a call line, in an app, and in a website. And in each case is able to do significantly better than the best available methods funded by the National Cancer Institute that are available through the tobacco money on quit lines or through apps and websites. Well, the public health impact, if you can increase it just a little bit, never mind the 30 and 40 and 50% better outcomes that Jonathan's getting, are huge. Not just dollars saved, but lives, actual lives saved.
Amazing.
So this could be so important to people.
So this is just a great example of how ACT can really work well in e-health context, right?
I think when you know the process and know how to move it, it opens up the territory, and we as a community need to think, and therapists need to think of the other roles they can play. For example, if you are in an agency and you know these data, yes, of course, set up a group or take on patients, but can you also find a way to get people when they first call, that they'll have a link sent to them of a website or a call made to them by a mental health a practitioner who's with lower level of training and maybe doesn't cost as much but has some skill. There was a recent study with colorectal cancer survivors looking at how they responded after they were diagnosed and treated for colorectal cancer. It's called Can Change, the Can Change trial. And really for one of the first times in that literature, it showed that calls by nurses produced a significant increase in compliance with medical regimens around diet, exercise, elimination of fats, alcohol, etc.
Again, the human component.
Yes, but it also, again, the focus on a process leading to an unusual outcomes. In this case, with and one of the nice things that they showed was the post-traumatic growth, because it's traumatic to be diagnosed with cancer, was notably increased by ACT. So you got people to begin to think about their own mortality and what do you want to do in your life. Well, that's something when you have a life-threatening disease that is actually a positive thing that you can make lemonade out of these lemons, but you need help in doing it, and so
values-based work from ACT would be really, of course.
So exactly, and so I think ACT therapists need to think about not just delivering technologies for people inside their systems of care, but what these processes say for the organization of their systems of care. Because they say things about prevention or early treatment or step cares models or things like that could be very useful to human beings, and the people who have to speak for that are the people who have the knowledge. So the ACBS community has to reach out to the government and agencies and so on and let people know that there's things that we know that can give help and that can reduce cost and increase outcomes.
The Dutch chapter has a semester this year, 5 years. So we were actually wondering if you have any suggestions what to do in the next 5 years. How should the Dutch chapter develop further, and how could we contribute?
Well, actually, one suggestion I'd make, you've done such a good job about building and supporting the researchers and the clinicians and working together. And the community has both. Some chapters not so much. The Dutch really do. You have a good combination of people there. But part of what I would look to is who are the providers and where are the areas that you can bring these principles and to involve the community. So whether it's educators or prevention scientists or people in physical health or those who are in organizations or working with children, can we take the core of what you built here and make these connections, build these bridges, bring people, not so much just I don't think of this as dissemination. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. Because dissemination implies we already know what to do and here you need to use it. It's something more like creating connections around how the needs of other related communities can be informed by, but also can inform us as to what we need to be focusing on in our work so that we can be there and meeting the multiple needs of people in the different settings in which change can happen. So I think that would be a good focus, is thinking
for the next 5 years, I guess
open, more communitarian way.
Yeah. Well, I'll, as a board member, try to do my best in contributing to that part. So I guess I'd really like to thank you, Professor Hayes, for your time and willingness to, give us some great advice on the local issues challenges, I would say, and questions we had. It's a pleasure.
Glad to do it.